treat, this is what happened. Carlsen started out with d4, taking a leaf out of Karjakin's book. Both players apparently abandoning one e4 that we saw dominate the first half of the match. And after knight to f6, and then the move knight f3, we were clearly going to head towards something that probably wasn't the most traditional queen's pawn game, as normally the queen's pawn is followed up with c4. But once Karjakin played the move d5, we knew for sure we'd be getting something interesting, because his most commonly road traveled as black is the move e6. He's a Nimzo player by trade, a Nimzo Indian, and against c4 he is known as probably the strongest Queen's Indian player on the planet. So you would think that the challenger might go for e6, inviting his best and most commonly used weapon, but apparently he either wasn't interested in seeing what Carlsen had prepared, or he had his own preparation in mind and played d5. Carlsen instantly decides, well, I'm not going to go down that road and let you show me what you've prepared, because I have the move 3e3 in mind. Now this goes into a Kali. A Kali, spelled C-O-L-L-E, is an opening that is structurally very sound, and it creates usually a flexible center where you have options to expand on both the king side and the queen side, depending on what you're into that day. But at its best, in its best moments, the Kali potentially gives white very, very dangerous attacking chances, starting with really over control over the dark squares and a launching pad with a move like knight e5. We're going to get to that in the middle game here. But after e3, we get e6. The position is symmetrical. Here comes bishop d3 and the move c5. Now, after the move b3 is played, we are officially in a position that is very, very well known in the Kali, and it also sort of crosses into this line of the Zukertort. The Zukertort is an opening that, again, like the Kali, is solid and flexible at the same time. A lot of attacking games are shown after the move, for example, bishop d6 here, when in a lot of positions, if you give white just a bunch of moves, which I'll just make here to show you, if you give white all that white wants, white will at some point pop into this square on e5, maybe even after knight bd2, bishop d7, knight e5, and here you can see some of the potential risks for black. After moves like takes and takes, if natural play is continued with, at some point white is going to launch with moves like f4, supporting the knight, followed by a major piece lift of rook f3, and eventually that rook will slide over the king side and help attacking chances against the king. So this is the normal way that if white had all the things that white wanted, white would get. But Carlsen ran up against a very flexible approach from his opponent, which didn't make those easily followed king side moves easy to play. Starting with this position here. So after the move c5 and b3 was played, Karjakin played the move bishop to e7 rather than anything else. First of all, a move that, even though it seems less aggressive than when the bishop is on d6, the point is that the bishop on e7 is a better defensive piece, and in some cases that becomes critical for the bishop not to be on e5, so that you can actually capture on e5 with the knight. An example of a line that we might actually get there, let me show you. And that last line I just gave, in positions like this, taking with the knight is simply not a possibility, because pawn takes would instantly put black in Forktown. Population, ouch, right? So maintaining flexibility when you're on the black side of a Kali Zukertort kind of system is incredibly important. And it allows you to deal with whatever road white chooses for the attack with the most options possible. So I think this is an important and instructive point, again, just because most people are very commonly at this stage focused on, well, I just have to get all my pieces developed, so naturally I should just put them on their most active squares possible, imaginable, and that'll be the best place for them. But your pieces are not best placed on always the most active squares. They're best placed on the squares that have the bigger picture in mind for everybody, that cooperate with the overall theme the most. And so remember that. Sometimes in this position it can be careless and easy to put the bishop on this diagonal, but are you the one getting an attack? No. Anticipating or knowing the common patterns that your opponent is going to strive for in a structure might make you realize that a developing move like this is actually better. So I'm talking a lot about a very simple point that doesn't have a lot to do with the overall result of this game, but I think it's important just to understand how flexible and how disciplined Karjakin is, and very, very, he's very meticulous, and he knows he's very deliberate with the moves that he's choosing in the first stage of the game. So after castles, and the move bishop b2, we are in a very well-known position. And now Karjakin plays what is the best move in this position, the move b6. Again, flexible. Why? Because as soon as you put the knight on these squares is the moment you start running into the potential threats where white starts bringing his pieces into these squares, where you're forced to either take it and let this attack, start to get rolling for white on the king side, or do I let the knight build up and then my development becomes hard? I can't play b6 anymore because my knight is hanging. And the truth is that would be the case even if the knight was on d7, that you couldn't really go to b6 because probably this knight comes into here and again applies a fork to black, winning the bishop pair. So b6 is just a very disciplined and the correct development move order for black. Just really being disciplined in how he approaches it. Rather than keep the structure maintained and go for all the plans I've highlighted thus far, Carlsen decides that this is the right time to take it a different direction. And partly the reason I talk so much about Karjakin's last couple moves, bishop e7 and b6, is because I strongly believe that those very accurate defensive moves are what leads Carlsen to kind of get away from the idea of attacking on the king side here. Sometimes you attack on the king side because you woke up on the wrong side of the bed that morning and you just had to go checkmate your opponent. But if you're doing it right, you should be attacking on the king side when the position is talking to you and telling you, hey, there's weaknesses over there. Hey, your opponent has placed their pieces in ways that aren't going to defend properly. Hey, your structure is suggesting that you can attack that way. All these little things that we learn to listen to as chess players. And that's not a crazy chess player thing, like your pieces are talking to you, you just have to listen. But it's kind of true, your pieces are talking and you do just have to listen. So one of the things that strong players do well is they are flexible with their approach to the middle game. And so now is an opportunity for white to change the direction and to maintain a slight edge by not necessarily going for just a buckle down and let me go for this approach. And again, I'll point out that one of the reasons why knight e5 might be met is because with the bishop coming to b7 and putting pressure on e4, what will end up happening here is now the c6 square is guarded, so black can bring his other knight in to d7 without knight to c6, as I highlighted earlier. And if white just goes forward with his plan of doubling up the knights, black can do the same. Black can meet him pound for pound in the center as far as the knights getting those squares. And the same would be true with f4. You could still see this knight come in here because of the protection. So it just makes, this is not going to be the brilliant, I'm going to go checkmate black on the king side kind of game for Carlsen anymore. And so he changes things up appropriately. And that's what's starting with the move d takes c5. So we get bishop takes c5, knight b to d2. And what we're going to get now is a symmetrical middle game where really the only concrete differences in the position are just the placement of the minor pieces, right? On a structural level, what do you have? You have 4 versus 4, 2 versus 2, and they're on the exact same squares. So it's not to say these kind of games don't have a lot of life. That's not true at all. The point is that it becomes, it's not a game where both sides, one side is just overly targeting their positional weakness on the king side, the other side is doing it on the queen side, and there's this very clear dynamic race going on, both sides striving for different things. Here, both sides kind of want the same things. They want to make sure their pieces get their most dangerous, their most powerful, their best squares in the center, the safest squares. And so because they're all sort of fighting over the same squares here in the middle of the board, the game is essentially a matter of who will outplay the other with piece placement. So after the move queen e7 was played, we get one little trick. Carlsen plays the move a3, which if you want to pause the video and ask yourself, what is this little trick Danny speaks of with a3? What exactly is Carlsen planning? Well, I'll point it out if the rook was to move anywhere. Again, you can pause the video if you want, or too late. The point is that a3 threatens a very simple move, b4, which if you give me the opportunity to get the bishop pair, I'm never going to look back. Two bishops pointing toward the king side are very happy to see you, and things are going to get weird. So weird in Danny's awkward sense of humor way, but good for white in the very logical chess sense way. This is exactly the kind of position you don't want when your opponent has the bishop pair in an open board. So of course, Karjakin doesn't go for that. He plays a5, and now we bring pieces to the center. Everybody brings their rooks in, because that's the kind of party we're into right now. After knight f8, bringing the knight to the king side and maybe defending, Carlsen decides I need to relocate in a similar fashion. I'm going to bring my bishop to f1. And then we get our first truly critical moment of the game when black starts with knight to g4. And this is when the first storyline, or let's say the first moment that backs up what proves to be the overarching storyline of Game 8, maybe even the match, starts to come into play. So far the game has been everything I've talked about in regards to the collie, the opening. Hopefully you've learned some things about my pieces of advice on how the players played the opening and how we're preparing for this open and dynamic middle game. But now the specifics of this game are that neither side really has much here. The position's pretty much equal. If you don't believe me, you can just look at the engines ahead as I really let them have a long think. Again, if you don't like the engines, I know that the comments from my last video were sort of mixed. Just ignore it. Just don't even look at it. Don't look for affirmation or confirmation. Just focus right here in these beautiful eyes and focus on the analysis and the advice I'm giving you. For those who really like it and feel like the video lacks without it, then you're welcome. The point is that Knight to G4 is a move that brings a piece toward the king side. Number one, okay? It opens up for another piece to come to the king side, whether that's H4 or G5. And when you combine that with the fact that these bishops are here, there's potential for danger here. So Carlsen should probably take notice of this and play one of the three moves the engine is actually recommending. Any one of those moves would have been better than what he did. Queen E2, Knight E2, H3, get rid of this knight. This probably makes the most sense. But Carlsen was ready to be aggressive. He wanted the game to get nuts. He wanted the game to be mixed up so that he could really get his winning chances that he's so long desired since having 2 games with black back-to-back, games 6 and 7. And so he played the move Knight to B5, which is just a bad move. And if you look at exactly what the engine is recommending, that's exactly what Karjakin should have played. For whatever reason, Karjakin was not ready to follow through with that. I have a hard time believing he didn't calculate the potential power of this move, but we're going to show it anyway, just in case he didn't. The move Queen to G5 probably needs to be met by a move like, I don't know, bringing the knight back to D4, a move that retreats the knight, but unless the move E5 is actually just crushing here, actually, and the computer might be proving that wrong, I'm not even sure that if that's the case, then maybe black would already have really had the initiative. But even if E5 is possible on Knight to D4, let me first highlight for you the key tactics behind Queen to G5 and why. Again, it just points out that Carlsen's last move was sort of reckless. He removes a knight from the center, he decentralizes his own minor piece, puts it on an unprotected flimsy square, and he did so sort of laughing in the face of danger like Simba, right? He did so even after his opponent had just said, hey, look at me, right? I'm coming over here to your king side, right? I'm going to go checkmate you, yeah? And he just plays Knight to B5 anyway. So he deserved to be punished with the move Queen to G5. And the issue is that probably after the move Queen to G5, if Carlsen plays any sort of normal move to justify this move, like Knight C to D6, the key line and the move that the computer doesn't see right away, but once it does find it, the whole evaluation changes. That is the move Knight to H4. This move is exactly what Carlsen would not want to face. The move Knight takes B7 is met by Knight to F3 check. Pawn takes F3. Rook takes D1. Queen takes will allow a discovered check and winning the queen. And so after the move Rook takes D1, we get Knight to E5 check. And black is going to win this game. King to H1 is met by Knight takes F3, and there's a mate either on G1 or the queen is lost. So probably the move Bishop G2 is needed, and after Knight takes King H1, we transpose. And okay, the position is not just resignable yet for White. White does technically have 3 pieces for the queen, but these are not the most coordinated 3 pieces we've ever seen on the board. And moves like Queen to G6 heading into C2, moves like Queen H4 try to eventually get more targets on H2. Black has a clear, I would dare say, winning advantage in this position. And there may even be other tactics that are possible here for black after Queen to G5. So if that's the case, and if Knight D4 doesn't work based on what the computer was just telling me, I'm just going to go with it because I had already analyzed it. H3 is the only other move, but now on Knight E5, what you're going to see is a position where probably Carlsen would have been forced apart with the bishop pair, because with the threat of Knight F3 check coming and this pawn pinned, probably the only real option at some point is to take on E5, which now we have the bishop pair for black and an open position which can only be good for those 2 bishops. So it's amazing that Knight to B5 was played at such a high-level match, and it was played in such a way that really laughed in the face of danger of Knight G4. But perhaps even more amazing, again, is that Karjakin didn't play Queen to G5. He played the move Bishop to C6, which is a move that seems okay on its own right. It's a solid move and kind of invites maybe Knight back to D4. Who knows? Maybe a repetition. But Carlsen doesn't want a repetition. Carlsen wants to play for a win, hence the reason he played knight to b5, laughing in the face of danger to begin with. So a4 was played, and after bishop to d5, we get a series of pretty logical moves where both sides had an idea of where they wanted to take the exchanges here. Takes on c4 with rook takes, and after takes and the other rook takes, Carlsen already had the idea that he was going to execute to try to create some imbalance. Unfortunately, at this point, he's willing to create imbalance at such a risk to his own detriment. It's such a risk to his own entity, his own being. He played the move b takes c4, which is very anti-Russian schoolboy. I'll tell you that if you're Sergey Karjakin. The move b takes c4 has something in mind, to give Carlsen credit. He's hoping that if Black had traded, he could take with the e-pawn. He loves the idea of this 3-on-2 sort of dynamic over here. If he can organize a move like c5, he'll end up with a passing c-pawn and the potential of hitting the a-pawn, like a move like queen to c3 coming followed by c5. So there were some goals there, but the problem is that as soon as Karjakin neglected to make this trade and even gave Carlsen the d-file, he was strapped and sort of left having to prove this capture, because really what b takes c4 does, regardless of the dynamic imbalance it gives white, it creates two very, very clear positional weaknesses. The a4 pawn is weak, the c4 pawn is weak, and this is going to come back to hurt white on the queen side, no doubt. So he did so either hoping for the 3-on-2 or because he evaluated the d-file as being worth it, and he did indeed get control over that d-file. But in the end, was it worth it? Let's see. I mean, here Carlsen now plays g3. This move makes sense, as does bishop g2. But again, in this position, probably the best thing for Carlsen to do was to be a little more solid, maybe play a move like h3, which guards g4, opens up a square for the king on h2. Then maybe he can prepare to slowly expand. Instead, Carlsen was continuing in his sort of all-in, on-tilt mode with f4. And now knight a7. He wanted tactics, and he was showing that he wanted tactics for the last, several hours here, right? Playing the move knight to b5. Karjakin didn't take his chance. But then he doesn't stop there. He goes for b takes c4 just to create an imbalance that would leave him with the d-file, risking the positional integrity, I guess you could say, of the queen side. And now he wants more tactics, bringing the knight to c6. It looks good for white at first, but will it work out? Here's the problem. You go attack me, I'm going to go attack you, and let's see who gets there first, right? You're going to attack me with tactics. I'm going to go take advantage of your positionally weak pawn. And the truth is, after the smoke clearing in just a few moves, the evaluation of the position was becoming more and more clear. And that was that Karjakin, for the first time in the match, probably had a very, very strong, very, very clear advantage. In this position, after the move g6 and queen to d4, king to g7, Carlsen really has only one move, I think, that probably maintains the balance in this position. He sacrificed the a-pawn to get this counterattack, and he probably intended on giving up this a-pawn in some fashion the moment he played b takes c4. You can't really cripple your structure and then expect them to walk themselves back to life, right? You created the scenario, now you better get compensation to justify your weak queen side. The problem is now the solid way to play the position is really with the move rook to d7, which creates pressure on f7. And after, let's say that black tries to offer a queen trade in one way or the other because he's up a pawn, even a move like rook a7 is probably okay for Carlsen. He has threats like knight to e5, which are going to put pressure on f7. If you trade, I take back. And can you really say, even with the pawn advantage, that black is any better here? Moves like rook to c8 are easily met by knight e5, and your best case scenario is to just come back. So I think it would be hard to say that white isn't even a little better here, which it should tell you how much of a hold white has in this position, because regardless of my human opinion, the computer only thinks in terms of math, and it knows that black is up a pawn, yet it still says the position is sort of favoring white here, right? So that tells you I'm probably onto something with the evaluation that this would have been fine for white. Carlsen didn't do that, though. He didn't play rook d7, and he didn't play the other move the computer seems to be liking, which is knight e5. I would say knight e5 is probably along the same roads of what I recommended rook d7 to be about, Be more solid, be more patient. Yes, black's up a pawn, but these pieces are misplaced, and we can put pressure on f7. Plus, if black blunders here, in this position, we have a threat like knight to g4, taking advantage of the pinned knight. So either one of those moves would have been more acceptable, but Carlsen was not to be deterred from the most aggressive and risky way to play this position. Perhaps playing those two blacks and getting those draws really affected his psychological stance on the match, because now he played a move that, regardless of how long we've been letting the computer think, still is not in the top 3, because it's just a horrible, horrible move. In this position, Carlsen played c5, sacrificing a pawn, and letting Black's potential initiative start to run wild with it. And here Black took the pawn after trading on d8, which is exactly what Black should be doing. And Black was headed toward a position that really can only be won by one player until this moment right here, where maybe the biggest blunder of the game was actually made. Karjakin is in the driver's seat, again, ironically, as Black, and this game is headed toward the result that would be shocking to the world. All Karjakin needs to do is make sure he deals with the coming tactics. There's weird threats, right? Knight takes e6 check is a threat, because this knight is pinned to the queen. And if you have to take back with the pawn, you allow moves like queen e7 check, winning the knight, and then the attack commences. So as long as you don't allow knight takes e6 check threats, you should be right. You should be doing okay if you're Karjakin, right? Yeah, exactly, and that's why the move like queen a4 would have been perfect. Queen a4, queen takes b6. Probably the most logical thing to do is to put the knight back on d7. Defending everything, immediately play the move queen to b4 and just drive the a-pawn. This is a completely winning endgame for Black, a healthy extra pawn, and weaknesses on the king side to target to go with it. This would have been disastrous for Carlsen. But unfortunately for Team Karjakin, and fortunately for Team Carlsen, Karjakin saw this threat of knight takes e6, but defended it with a blunder. He played queen d3, and Carlsen quickly snapped up this pawn. Maybe breathing a sigh of relief, right? The one thing about this position is that both players were under time pressure. So before I'm too critical on the blunders being made back and forth here, I think the criticism to c5 is justified. It's just a reckless on-tilt move by Carlsen. But the move queen d3 and then knight takes e6, all these moves were played under time pressure. Yes, Karjakin missed the clear way to win, but maybe he did the best he could under time pressure, and now he has to deal with knight takes e6, unfortunately, for the Russian in the same way that I just described before. He still can't take with the knight, not because of the pin, but because of the queen. But that means taking with the pawn is going to allow this, and after the pawn on g6 likely falls, we're probably headed for a draw, right? a4 is played, e4 is played. Of course, Black cannot take the pawn because queen takes g6 would now be instantly winning for White. So Karjakin came back to d7, and it looks like we're headed toward a draw after queen takes g6, queen g7 check. The repetition will ensue, right? Hashtag twist ending. Look how I've been setting you up if you actually don't know the result with this Tarantinoing of the movie that you're watching, predicting the fact that it should be a draw. And in all seriousness, Carlsen, if he knew what was good for him, should have played the move queen to g6 check. But what storyline did I foreshadow back on move 19 as being the overarching theme to this game, and it may be the match? Carlsen is not playing to his character. Carlsen is normally the best in the world at taking what the position gives him, not being reckless in his behavior, not playing for more than the position allows, taking the draw if it's there, and getting the most out of the small chances he gives. He's better than every other chess player on the planet because he does take what the position gives him, and he's willing to play positions that should be a draw on and on and on until people crack. In this game, it seemed from the outset, frustrated perhaps with not taking advantage of his opportunities in Game 7 where he could have been better with Black. I don't know. I'm guessing psychologically. He really just lost himself here, regardless of the mistakes made up to this point, and the fact that Carlsen maybe could have been lost on knight takes b5, the fact that I didn't like b takes c4. The truth is, Karjakin blundered back under time pressure with this move queen d3, and Carlsen just needed to accept what he has and play queen to g6. But he didn't. He played queen to c6. Now again, does that mean the game is over right here? No, the evaluation is probably only about half a pawn for Black at this point. But he's going away from the only logical area where the queen must belong on the board and playing a position that there's no way he can be the one who wins this. So you can't play that kind of chess against another super grandmaster. I understand being frustrated and wanting to be aggressive and being the favorite in a match. But you can't go for a position where your opponent is playing for 2 results and you're only playing for 1 and think that you're also somehow playing for 2 results. White can only draw this position, and you just walked away from your only chance at the draw. And for those wondering what would have happened on check and king h8, it's still a draw because white has to move e5. You're going to remember this theme that opening up and liberating this bishop is something Carlsen was never able to do again in this game, and it came back to haunt him. With a5, moves like a3 can be met by queen b1. I mean, the point is black can't help the pawn. You can't get to a8 because you'll hang the queen. And if you go to anywhere else, at some point, you're going to be inviting this queen back to g6 with perpetual. So the point is that white is in plenty of time to defend the a-pawn, or if black gets all in and tries to do it, white will swing back. White can do this sort of yo-yo effect and go back to g6 and eventually draw the game. So white would have not been in danger there. But Carlsen played queen to c6. He wanted that win, and it was reckless, it was dangerous, and before you know the result, it may come back to bite him. Here again, he plays f5. Maybe e5 again was the best option. It's hard to say because to justify queen c6, you kind of have to start to create more counterplay again, the counterplay your queen just left behind. But probably he needed again to liberate the bishop, which he did not do. After f5, a3 takes e6, and now the move king to g7. We're really up against the wall if we're playing the white pieces with the last chance to draw here. The truth is the challenger probably had other moves he could have played, including not even just a3 now, but even a3 the move before. But now in this position after taking on e6, the truth is that, again, maybe king h7 would have avoided some checks on the diagonal. But in this position, he has his final chance, and it would have been with this move queen to b5. The point is he just needs to let this pawn be captured back, go to b4, and make the best effort he can to just get this a-pawn before it's too late. The game is still going to be a draw. A best-case scenario for white despite the extra pawn. You can't win a position when your opponent has complete dominance over the dark squares. So, you know, let's say we get some sort of position where the queens can't be traded at this point, white would lose. But the point is, even if you know, let's say white gets this pawn here, Carlsen could never go on to win this game. At some point, black is going to establish the knight on e5, similar to what Karjakin did in the game. But at least in these positions, Carlsen has a chance to sack the e-pawn, liberate the bishop. Again, he can use both pieces to try to hold back the passed a-pawn. Instead, Carlsen sort of hallucinates, again, who's the one playing for the win here, and plays this move e7. After queen takes e7, he's gonna get a position that's similar to what I just highlighted. The problem is it happens much faster for black, and Karjakin is able to establish this knight on e5 before Carlsen can even look up. The difference is very big. Despite the fact that white is actually up this pawn is a huge detriment to white's position. Without this pawn on the board, the position is probably a draw, because white can set up a battery with the queen and bishop working together, both guarding a2, and you just don't care about checks. You're willing to give a draw with perpetual, because if they start taking pawns, your queen and bishop might be able to get an attack, and I'm going to show you a line where that could have happened. But the fact that white was unable to get the liberation of this bishop, and black is now able to combine two things: the queen and knight working together for threats against the king, and the threat of this a-pawn, is going to leave Carlsen's position almost hopeless. So, after the move knight e5 occurs, Carlsen had one more chance to make right on, maybe not make right, but again, go for the idea I was talking about. He should go for this move queen b7 check. Either hope that the king gives a perpetual, or that if the knight blocks and we put this queen on a8, maybe, just maybe, Karjakin allows some idea where we get to sacrifice this e-pawn. And in scenarios like this, as I said, we can actually create a potential drawing scenario. The point is, moves like check are just not a worry for white, because you can't win this position. You're hoping they go for the draw. You know, that would be your dream scenario. The fact that your queen and bishop are coordinated enough to hold back this pawn is really all you care about, and it should force the hand in a way that I think white would have great winning chances. I'm not going to analyze the position now for hours, but not winning chances, but drawing chances. I'm tired if you can't tell. It's been a very long day covering this game. So either queen to b7 check and back to a6 at the very least, make Karjakin show the winning plan. I'm not as big of a fan of this line, because I I think that the more opportunities you give white, you give black, at some point the dark squares will be guarded and the threat of a2 will commence. So I like the idea of putting the queen on a8 with the hope that I can get this position where the queen and bishop are protected. But for sure, there's no disagreements that Karjakin was the only one who could win, which is, again, why we don't understand what Carlsen was doing. He was playing for a position where Karjakin was playing for 2 results. And in this position, instead of any of those ideas, he blundered. Carlsen played the move queen to e6. Doesn't look so bad at first. It says, oh, maybe I'll get chances here, and I am guarding a2. But after the move h5, probably white could have resigned already. The point is, the biggest threat in this position, if you do nothing, is the move, I'll just show you, for example, of queen a6. The problem is the move h4 is coming in this position. After g takes h4, moves like queen to c3 are slowly but surely going to put white in a position where there's no way to deal with the threats of b2 and the threats against the open king. The pawns and the number of them are irrelevant. What matters is who will create the concrete threat of getting a queen. And in order to stop that, white will probably have to sacrifice a mating net. The position is just lost. If you don't believe me, analyze it yourself. Because of that, Carlsen was up against the wall, couldn't allow h4, and he played h4 himself. Well, here comes the knockout blow, kids. 1, 2, 3, a2. And just like that, the game is over. Carlsen resigned. Yes, you finally know the result. No more twist endings. Why is a2 so good? Well, I'm threatening to get a queen. And if white takes it, the mate is forced. Knight to g4 check. King up to h3. The queen comes into g1, threatening mate. And the point is there's no check on a7 because my queen guards it. And there's check on b2 is the last one you get after king to g6 because b6 is also guarded by the queen. No way to deal with the threat of either queen h2 mate other than, I guess, something like bishop f3, which would just run into this sort of checkmate, and the queen is lost. So where does that put us? First of all, are you not entertained, right? This was a wild, wild affair. This was a wild, wild game, and it was in the end, it was the challenger who got the best of the situation. He came up with the win and now leads the match by a full point, which is shocking, I think, from the perspective that that he got there by winning as black. But it's not shocking given the way the game, Carlsen just did not play well, and Karjakin played phenomenal. Karjakin took advantage of his opportunities as they were given, with the exception of maybe playing queen to g5 against knight to b5 earlier. Karjakin has been sticking to the sort of solid, I'm going to frustrate Magnus Carlsen strategy. And it paid off because the world champion pushed way, way too hard in a game that he had no business playing for a win. He did, and he had to pay for it. If you haven't been watching our live shows, maybe now's the time because we have a world championship match, everybody. Game 9 is going to be Wednesday, November 23rd after the rest day, and we will be covering it live at 5 p.m. Pacific at chess.com TV. So, again, we are in a position of potentially bringing in a new world champion unless Carlsen can turn it around. Do I think the match is over? No. Let's not forget that world championship matches have been decided in the last game before. Kramnik won in the last round versus Peter Leko in 2004. Kasparov won in the last round in one of his matches with Karpov. I don't remember the year because I'm exhausted. But it does happen. But the truth is, right now with what we've seen Carlsen playing uncharacteristically aggressively poor chess, and Karjakin doing exactly what he needed to do coming into this match, taking the opportunities he was given. If the underdog is going to win, that's what they must do.